Well, now we are here in a new episode of Late Night Anarchy, and I'm happy to have Todd Seavey, the author of Libertarianism for Beginners, and to talk about his new book, Libertarianism for Beginners, and we will talk about other things related to Libertarianism for Beginners. But first, the question that I wanted to ask is how you became a libertarian.
Oh, my story of how I became one is not that unusual or exciting, really. I just was fairly politically moderate in high school, and then in college read, at first I read utilitarians and Nietzsche, and I was sort of drawn to both. I liked the rationalism and the economics of utilitarianism. But there was something about Nietzsche and the idea of being an individual free spirit that was exciting. And I thought there must be a way to reconcile these things. And then I decided libertarianism was sort of like a combination of those things, and also a nice balance between the liberal and conservative impulses I'd grown up with and sort of oscillated between. I was never religious, so I wasn't a normal conservative, but I was very suspicious of communism, so I didn't really fit on the left. And libertarianism seemed sane and moderate to me, even though, of course, to many people it's radical and crazy.
Oh, well, I mean, my story, I suppose, with libertarianism is even quite more strange. I was a philosophy student, and I was interested in contemporary philosophy, and I read a blog about a guy that write about Foucault. And funny enough, he was very interested in the so-called late period of Foucault, when Foucault became some sort of free marketeer.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, he always put links to reason, but I never put the click in the links. But once he wrote an article about Carhes, and I was very impressed with Carhes, and then I more or less read the Dead of Politics, and I read more about Carhes and Rothbard, and I guess I'm some sort of a left libertarian. But on the other hand, I consider myself to be very influenced by Bill Kaufman, and in that sense, I guess I'm somewhat of I don't know how to say it in a very strange way. I sometimes have called myself a left-wing paleo-libertarian. It sounds quite strange.
It happens. Actually, developing a newfound respect for Foucault, in a way, is a little embarrassing for me, because I spent a lot of my time in college complaining about French literary theorists. So in the early 90s, they were all the rage, and Derrida and Lacan and deconstructionism were constantly talked about on Ivy League campuses like Brown University, where I was, in Rhode Island in the US. And I hated those people so much that it's a little embarrassing to find out that Foucault is one of our great defenders of markets. Although he went through, as you probably know, he went through so many phases that I suppose it was inevitable he would hit capitalism eventually. I mean, for a while he was a Marxist. For a while he was actually a fan of the Iranian Islamic Revolution, and then
yes, that's good.
And then a few years later, he was what would now be, or what was in the 90s broadly called a neoliberal, I guess. But you know, we'll take it if that's what it takes to get some Marxist literary theorists to read about capitalism in a more sympathetic way. I guess any port in a storm. Actually, this election year in the U.S. has made both the left and the right look stupid enough that I'm willing to think in broader terms than I used to, and reconsider big picture philosophical allegiances. So if we have to end up with some combination of paleoconservatism, Foucault, moderation, populism, and transhumanism, to attract people's attention, I'm willing to try just about anything at this point.
Yes, well, I mean, the funny thing is that what I was reading Foucault, I was a member of the Socialist Party, and I guess the most strange thing is, despite that I have quoted Rothbard and any other things that the strike and as free market impulse, I haven't been expelled of the party, and I have tried to reach out to try to in some way make it a more left libertarian leaning party. I think that there is something interesting to say. To be fair, I haven't been go to the meetings for a while, but there were some more or less anarchists, or not, I don't know if called anarchists in the exactly term, but socialist libertarians that are relatively serious about free markets. They think that the state should be reduced, and that's kind of interesting.
Great.
But back to your book, how, I mean, it's here. It finally came.
Excellent.
I think I told you the story, because the problem with books here in Peru is that books in English is very difficult. If a library has it, it usually has books for kids, like if they are in high school learning to read English. But so I have to pay to buy it on Amazon. But the problem is that the default option is with the National Post in Peru and the National Postal Service. So it takes like 3 months, and apparently Amazon said that it was have shipped in just a week, but it was almost lost in the headquarters of the post service. So it is another example of governments doing a lousy job.
Perhaps Brazil should work out some sort of sponsorship where there could be a big headquarters for Amazon near the Amazon, and then they could yes. adopt part of the river. That'd be good branding.
Yes.
Win-win for everybody. Oh,
yeah.
Well.
But back to the original question, how did you came with this idea of writing this book?
Well, actually, the publishers came to me. So they do many books on different topics, and the title is always, blank, whatever the topic is, for beginners. So they've done things like Nietzsche for beginners, Derrida for beginners. They even had one already called Ayn Rand for beginners.
Interesting.
Although not one on libertarianism in general. And I think one of the things that made them think it might be a good time to do a Libertarianism for Beginners book is that back when they came up with the idea, some people were hoping Rand Paul might be the Republican nominee for president this year, which would have helped to boost publicity a little, I suppose. And that didn't work out, but I wrote the book anyway. And I'm glad in a way that I didn't write more about Rand Paul in the book. I mean, I wasn't sure how important he was going to be. And by the time I was done with it, he had pretty much been destroyed by Donald Trump in the Republican Party primary, which made me sad. In fact, not only does reading parts of my own book make me feel a little sad, like this has been a stupid year for American presidential politics, but looking back at Rand Paul's book from last year makes me very sad, because I think he would have been a good president. And in his book, he talks a lot about limited government and free markets and constitutionalism. And it's all the stuff we want to hear. And now he's off the stage and it's sort of irrelevant, at least for the time being. Oh, well. But people can still read Libertarianism for Beginners, regardless of who's running for president. So
yeah, I was thinking, and I haven't read completely the book, but I was thinking it was very interesting the way how it is portrayed, and it's very graphic for the people who have already read it, or for those who like this kind of stuff.
It has cartoons.
It's interesting. It has cartoons, yes, and one of the parts that most interested me most was the part of the the libertarian schools, the paleo-libertarian, left libertarians. I think you have portrayed a very interesting divisions, and I think they are, relatively speaking, the most broad, because I know that even inside these divisions there are like divisions and divisions. For example, I think of libertarians, for example, um, uh, there are the most I don't know. For example, Will Wilkinson is someone that goes that I consider a libertarian, even if he doesn't like the term, because I I think that call him a liberal will be kind of strange, since he's someone who would have worked as a policy analyst for Cato. I don't think that with the kind of stuff that he has written, you can describe him as a liberal. But on the other hand, people like Jason Brennan are much more radical in their own way, and despite that he may not be in an exact way an anarcho-capitalist. And for example, but I think that and I don't know how much you think about the global libertarian scene, because it changed very much. For example, in Latin America, there is a very interesting guy which teach philosophy. And actually, the guy that makes me read Carges teach philosophy at the university in Buenos Aires. And he had done the recent introduction to the new edition of Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And he, for example, considers himself a left libertarian minarchist, which is not necessarily much common, but I think he's relatively a public intellectual. I mean, in Argentina, he is invited to, he has been on TV, he has been on the radio, he has spoke at very public conferences. So he is not necessarily someone who has come up with a crazy idea. I think he has a very thoughtful idea, but he understands that especially in Latin America, the power of the governments are still relatively large to think in anarchy, at least in the closer terms.
And I used to think, I guess back in the 90s, that the more subdivisions and types of libertarianism, the better. You know, it seemed sort of fun. I think especially for a young person, it seems exciting if you discover different forms of it. But I don't know, the older I get, the more I worry that libertarians spend a lot of their time fighting with each other instead of fighting government. And in particular, if there are left libertarians and right libertarians, I'm starting to think they end up replicating many of the arguments that occur in the rest of the political spectrum. So it's bad enough that the rest of society is constantly fighting over religion or feminism, but if libertarianism is now spending all of its time fighting over topics like that, or racism, then I worry there isn't much time left over to talk about the issues that are unique to libertarianism and that we all ought to agree on, like shrinking government and shoring up property rights. But I don't know, especially with social media, I don't know if there's any way to stop people really from breaking off into their own tiny groups, ever smaller, ever more numerous. So there may be no way to stop that. I just hope they'll get along well enough on the issues they agree on to keep pushing back against government and remember what the real enemy is.
Well, you said I have here the interview with Tom Woods, and you said that basically there is basically one idea about libertarianism that was closer to the definition of the non-aggression principle. Do you think that libertarianism is the non-aggression principle?
I just think that's the easiest way to describe it. So I'm not someone who would say that if you violate the non-aggression principle, you cease to be a libertarian. I recognize that the word is used more broadly than that, but I would say that it happens to be the easiest way, I think, to explain the basics of the philosophy to people, which is what I do in the book, and I do think it's correct. I mean, I do think people should abide by the non-aggression principle, though I realize that's a radical and rare position. So in the book, I sort of start with it as a model, and then I acknowledge that there are other schools and there are more subtle approaches to the topic, Hayek and Milton Friedman and so forth. I guess you could call it an ideal case in a way, or the most, the strictest, purest version in a way, regardless of whether you think it's the correct version.
I think your book is interesting, and I think, I don't know if your editors have told you if the book is available on physical outside the US.
Oh, I should definitely know that, and I am not sure. I don't think it's been translated, but I think it is physically available outside the U.S. I'll have to email you about that later, I guess.
Well, because I think that for French, it sounds Ron Paul is an international figure, and I think a lot of people in Latin America are very tired about what's the Latin American right. I mean, sometimes it's portrayed as somehow libertarian, but there is a good friend of mine and that is a member of the local chapter of Students for Liberty, and that have written about this on Pan Am Post, which writes, which is a libertarian site from Latin America, one of the few. And he has said that libertarianism should be more broad than left and right, and I agree, because a lot of times, sometimes people think that like in United States, that because he's a Republican, he's in a supposedly conservative party, he's going to be less intrusive. But a lot of them are socially conservative. They have a lot of programs which are enlarge governments, not shrink in any way. But so I was thinking that it has to do with the specific topics. For example, in Venezuela, the funny part is that even left libertarians are it's a curious case, Venezuela, because I mean, as you could imagine, on the one hand, the people of the C4SS sometimes could tweet, a critic of the Cato Institute to Venezuela. But on the other hand, they will not spend so much of their time, because they will fear that they will, on the other hand, will fear that their connection to the broad left will be in danger because of that. So it's a very complex relation. The same thing in Brazil, where the SVL was relatively more conservative leaning. I think in Latin America is still relatively more conservative leaning, because I think some chapters of the SVL in United States some have a relatively decent amount of left libertarians which tend to disagree. And then, for example, but the greater point that I wanted to make is that libertarianism could see to an interesting perspective of people. Even I, that were somehow on the radical left, to say in his own way, could have been attracted to libertarianism. I think anyone could do. And I think that the failure of governments, especially in Latin America, could make it work better. I think that Hispanics had a lot of reasons to doubt about the government in the United States, because precisely their experience, if not of them, of their parents or their grandparents in Latin America, where governments had a lot of burdens and so on. So I was thinking it's very interesting reading from outside the US. I know that it's very curious. The libertarian movement has, and its history has a lot to do with the United States, but I think there are some interesting things happening outside the United States, and even if I would call all of them by nature libertarians, but it's certainly a moment, especially with Bitcoin, with Uber, with Airbnb, the sharing economy is bringing libertarian concepts to the broader public. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, one nice thing, I suppose, about the principles of the left or libertarians, even though I often describe myself as preferring conservatives more than the left, at least the left and libertarians both agree that principles should be universal. They talk about human rights instead of just nationalism. So if you want an international movement, markets, just like socialism, is something you should be able to talk to like-minded people on the opposite side of the world about. Sometimes it's harder for conservatives to, get outside thinking about their own country and talk to people from another nation. Sometimes they doubt whether people should even be, making plans with people from other nations. I mean, Trump is in some ways a nationalist like Pat Buchanan, who thinks Putin should do his thing and we should do our thing over here, and the two should not mix. But the kinds of students who go to international conferences don't tend to think that way. And in that sense, maybe switching them from left to libertarian will prove easier than transforming some of the conservatives. We shall see. That might be changing if that might become more true if conservatives increasingly think like Le Pen or Trump and feel like globalism is the enemy and internationalism is the enemy. The last thing I would ever want to do is put an end to global trade. So whatever doubts I may have had about Trump when he started campaigning, for me, were resolved in a negative way when he started complaining about global trade and making it sound like China is harming us by selling us cheap products. That once you start talking like that, I kind of feel like you need to go back and read Adam Smith, and you're not really on my side anymore. So I guess I like globalism, depending on how you define it, and on that, libertarians and socialists and Hillary Clinton, in some sense, agree. The question, I guess, is what those global rules will be, and I would prefer they were just property rights. Hillary Clinton would prefer that there were lots of corporate donations to her, which is an important difference.
Yes.
But it's different than just being a nationalist who's proud of blood and culture and locality, which is also becoming that latter way of thinking, the nationalist way of thinking, is, as you probably know, becoming popular with some of the so-called alt-right people here who tend to like Trump, and some of whom even think of themselves as libertarians. But in the long run, they have a tendency to leave libertarianism and even turn into crypto-fascists in some cases. And I think that's probably bound to happen if you're afraid of the wider world and the changes that global trade or immigration could bring. So the alt-right is amusing in the short term, and we all like that cartoon frog they use once in a while, but I think it's a very dangerous path, and libertarians shouldn't really like it.
Yes, well, my other question was that I think foreign policy is a central part of libertarian identity. I mean, Ron Paul, probably his foreign policy is the reason why he's known. He was able to attract a very young and diverse core of constituents that not necessarily are the you see in front rallies, which are more or less older white people. It's not. But it was very interesting because if someone see footage of a Ron Paul rally, it was always mostly college kids. They were African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans. I mean, it was a very diverse crowd, and I think I will say that it was in some cases more diverse than even some Hillary and Bernie rallies, which was kind of shocking, but. It really shows that at least his foreign policy was in tune with the youth, and also, well, even if Justin Raimondo is very polemic in some ways, I think anti-war has also being able to to portray libertarianism as something more than tax cuts, for saying in some way. And to be fair, I think Jordan Arton Bloom, which used to write in the Daily Caller, I think it still writes in Front Porch Republic, and is the editor of the Midrelus. He has an article, I think, in the Daily Caller, which was about that the Koch brothers were more anti-war than Demos, which was a Hillary Clinton think tank. And I think it was very interesting, because if someone reads to the Cato Institute Foreign Policy team once, hears very anti-war stuff. I will grant the issue that on some particular issues, one or two could sound hawkish. In some of two issues, I think, but mostly they are along the lines anti-war, and I think also Reason generally is anti-war, and it's also funded in large part by the Koch brothers. So despite the bad fame of the Koch brothers, the Koch brothers are promoting peace in some way, I suppose.
And actually, I should admit at this point that I used to be more hawkish, in part just because I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, at least as a child, and so U.S. foreign policy was often united with an opposition to socialism and communism, so they seemed to sort of go together, and also because the Cold War usually didn't involve actively shooting. It involved a lot of threatening to shoot missiles if a nuclear war happened, but most of the time there wasn't that much fighting going on. Apologies to Nicaragua and everything. But anyway, but most of the time there wasn't active fighting. Well, I mean, there was always a little fighting somewhere, I should say, but there wasn't a whole worldwide active shooting war. And so I thought once communism collapses, everybody will, of course, want peace. Or, I mean, not everybody, but almost everyone, and we'll be able to shrink the military, and the conservatives will be happy that the Cold War is over, and they'll become more peace-loving. And for about a decade in the 90s, it looked like that might be true, just because the U.S. wasn't embroiled in any major wars. And then, of course, after 9/11, it started to become more apparent that I had been naive, and that there are at least some conservatives who just like war all the time, even when it's not necessary, and that libertarians, for the most part, were much more focused on foreign policy and anti-war issues than I had realized. So suddenly there was a split amongst my conservative and libertarian acquaintances that I had been unaware of, really, for about a decade, and I had to sort of choose sides or try to split the difference. And I was still hoping for a while George W. Bush was president, that, you know, maybe the American military would just focus on short engagements and taking out threats that imperiled global trade and the whole, whether you call it a global market or a mercantile order, just take out the threats that would result in people being unable to do trade. And then it would still be, in some sense, attempting to shore up property rights and liberty. But it doesn't seem they're going to stop. I mean, it's, you know, it's one country after another, and now Syria, and so on. And then at some point I started to read more about the actual philosophical underpinnings of some neoconservative thinking. And there actually is kind of, it's not just that they want bourgeois US society to thrive and thus fight to defend it. There is a love of martial virtues and militarism there, and they tend to associate militarism with strength. And I no longer trust that they ever really want an end to conflict. So I've gotten more radical and more impatient, and don't usually refer to myself as conservative, although I used to when I was younger. And thanks to Trump, and Hillary, I now pretty much hate both major American parties in the US and feel like neither of them has a coherent philosophy. So in that sense, I guess I've become more libertarian and more skeptical about foreign policy actions by the government. But you know, there were times back when George W. Bush was president where I could see other writers, even writers in the U.S. who weren't supposedly political writers, would say things occasionally that made me think they were sort of on my side and wanted a military that would just make the world safe for capitalism. In fact, I read a book about Genghis Khan, and I remember the writer almost talked about Genghis Khan as if he were a neoconservative, because he conquered places brutally and created an empire that was the largest contiguous empire that's ever existed to this day. But once he did that, you could pretty much worship as you pleased and trade within the conquered area, sort of like the Romans. You know, they had to be in charge, but then you could trade and live relatively peacefully once the Romans took over. I didn't want the U.S. to become Rome. Perhaps it will. And I didn't want it to be Genghis Khan. But, you know, I thought there are times when the military and commerce can go hand in hand, and when you may need the military to protect commerce. But I think it's gone way beyond that at this point, and it would be easier to just tell people we need a global peace movement, and don't trust the military, don't trust the police. For that matter, I would also say don't trust priests, but that's a separate issue. And I'm now just very skeptical of authoritarianism across the board, and respecting individual property rights is a way to cut through all of the factions and keep it simple.
Yeah, I sometimes have seen that there are some people that, despite didn't identify themselves as libertarians, are libertarians finding amusing. I think that on the left, for example, Tadeusz Russell, that they have been interviewing Reason, have written on Reason, even he several interviews that have been done to him, he has said that he's not a libertarian because he didn't agree with the non-aggression principle. And Michael Tracy, which Justin Raimondo almost all day keeps retweeting him, and is more or less a left-wing liberal and a Bernie supporter, I guess. And I don't know, Raimondo and other libertarians retweet him quite often. It's quite amusing. And I don't know, I suppose that on the right there should be someone like them. Because like when I was speaking to Lucy about what are the more decent libertarian congressmen, I was speaking about obviously Rand Paul, Justin Amash, Thomas Macy, but I was thinking that Jeff Flake, for example, is not as much of a standard Republican as other. That's someone that I think is more interesting than the average Republican.
Yeah, that's fair. And I suppose even Trump, as you probably know, is liked by some of the libertarians, including Justin Raimondo, because they think he'll be more anti-war. And it's probably true that Hillary is more likely to go to war than Trump, but I don't know how anyone can really trust Trump. I mean, he's so unpredictable, and he changes his mind so frequently, and he lies, and he seems so belligerent and temperamental just on a personal psychological level, that and talks about how he'd get tough against ISIS as if he thinks everyone else has just been twiddling their thumbs, and if he goes in, it'll be taken care of in a few days. And that seems like a dangerous attitude. But as a result of that, here a lot of people were looking to his vice presidential pick to see if that was an indication of whether Trump was anti-war. And his vice presidential pick is very much a hawk and a pro-military person. So I mean, I think that's an indication that you can't really rely on Trump to have fixed principles. But it didn't seem to bother Justin Raimondo. He's still a cheerleader for him. I don't fully understand it. I know other people who've turned into Trump supporters. I don't get it.
I think that Justin Raimondo is just loving that the neocons are having a bad time, And I think he has written an article about why he would Trump, despite that in some way he's rooting for him. But I don't know. When I was speaking to Lucy, Lucy said to me that she was kind of sad because the moment when neocons are sad, it's not because of how to say it. It's you can be sad because the Trump is in some ways worse than the neocons, and I don't know. It's quite a curious moment. I think.
I would say, in a weird way, the important thing about Trump might be that he's unknown and unpredictable, and Clinton is very predictable. I think we know what we're going to get from her, and it's pretty awful, but it's not that radical. It's familiar. We've been there before, so it really is, as they say, the devil you know versus the one you don't. It's sort of like a random roll of the dice versus business as usual, and which one you think is worse may depend on whether you're an optimistic person or a pessimistic person, or how well you think the system is working right now. If you think we're on the verge of collapse, then you're probably willing to take your chance with Trump and see if he changes something. If you think America's basically coasting along okay for now and will probably last a few more decades before it collapses, then you might think, I might as well stick with Hillary. She won't change anything too much, which means in an important sense, Clinton is sort of the more conservative choice in the sense of establishment and predictable, and Trump is perhaps the more radical choice. But it's hard to gauge, and I don't really like either of them. But so Lucy Steigerwald from antiwar.com, the Justin Raimondo site, she was saying she sort of feels sorry for the neoconservatives, you're saying, because of Trump?
I mean, no, not sorry, but she was kind of sad because, I mean, she would have been happy that the neocons are angry, but they are angry because of Trump, not because
who might be just as bad. Yeah, that's a good point. Or as I put it, back when I first started to realize that I had a few friends who were cheering for Trump, and that their reason was he upsets the neoconservatives so much, my response was, well, so would a werewolf or an asteroid impact. I mean, just because the neoconservatives are unhappy doesn't mean that something good is necessarily happening. I sort of had my neoconservative phase back when I was more sympathetic to the military, and when the military wasn't doing as much. And I suppose also philosophically, before I was a libertarian, when I was trying to figure out how to reconcile utilitarian thinking and Nietzsche, I did go through a brief kind of Neo-Platonist phase where I was interested in Alan Bloom, who's one of the neoconservative philosophy writers. So I had a little dash of neoconservatism at an important formative age when I was in college. And that sticks with you. It shapes the way that you think about things later. I will say this for some of the neoconservatives and the Straussians and Alan Bloom, they at least have a big healthy dose of pessimism about humanity. They're too optimistic about the military, perhaps, but they recognize that social order is a fragile thing, and that if you get it wrong, you could end up poor or being shot at or with riots in the streets. And I tend to agree with that. I'm not exactly optimistic about, if the government went away tomorrow and no one had a coherent philosophy, I don't think 2 days later they'd all just be happily trading with each other. I think a lot of people would panic and form roving bands of marauders and cannibals, and there'd probably be a period of horror and confusion, which I don't see as a reason to keep the government, but it is a reason to sort of educate people about philosophy and economics before you get rid of the existing social order. And so the Straussians and the neoconservatives kind of appreciate some of that stuff. Unfortunately, that means that they really like sort of the order and discipline that the military represents. I think that's part of their problem.
But I think maybe something good could come in this election if Gary Johnson campaign is going to somewhere. I think it was very surprising to me that he was invited to the Colbert show. No, especially now that he's hosting late night show, which is more mainstream than his old show. I mean, he's quite mainstream. I mean, even here in Peru, at least some people know who he is. So he's relatively, I mean, few people in the American house are really known overseas. So I guess he's really mainstream. On the other hand, I agree with the concept that Justin Raimondo and some people have said that he initially wasn't very mean or radical against Hillary because he knew that the liberal media wouldn't like that kind of stuff. So he tried to offer himself as an alternative. But I think now he's better and he is criticizing more Hillary and Trump, and he's more interesting now.
Unfortunately, Gary Johnson himself said that if he doesn't get into the debates with Trump and Clinton, then his campaign is basically over. And I think in about a week, the Presidential Debates Commission will announce who qualifies for the debates. And it doesn't look like Gary Johnson's going to qualify. I mean, if I were making the rules, he would. But the cutoff is supposed to be you've got the support of 15% of voters in polls, and in 5 different polls. And so far, I think there's only one of those polls where Gary Johnson's risen to about 15%, but it seems very unlikely that when the others are released in the next week or so, he will have suddenly leapt to 15%. So I don't think he's going to be in the debates. And at that point, by his own strategy, he says he pretty much gives up. So we might only be talking about him for another week or so, sadly, which also means that the last thing a lot of people will remember is that he was recently on television and he didn't recognize the name of a city from Syria, Aleppo, although I really question how many Americans would recognize the name of any city in Syria. But you know, I admit he's running for president, he should know. But it was very out of context. In the conversation he was having, no one had talked about Syria yet. They were talking mostly about domestic policy. So when someone said Aleppo, he thought they were talking about some acronym, an abbreviation for some organization, and got confused for a moment. But that might be the thing people remember him for, which is unfortunate. Meanwhile, I would say while he got one important thing wrong, I think Trump gets everything wrong. It's just that people don't press him on it. But almost every time you ask Trump about something, he's basically implicitly admitting he doesn't know what you're talking about. He just makes it sound like he does, in the way that a student who hasn't done his homework tries to make it sound like he really cares about what the professor is saying by just saying stuff like, oh, that's very important issue. Going to have a great answer on that. It'll be a stupendous plan. But you know, I don't think he knows what he's doing most of the time. Clinton knows the names of all the cities in Syria probably, and she plans to bomb them. So yeah, nobody's quite perfect.
I don't know if you watch the debates of the Libertarian Party, but they are quite amusing. This year, it was a very interesting field. It was the wild John McAfee, which was more of an instinctual libertarian. His instincts were libertarian. He's not necessarily a political philosophy libertarian, but he's someone who have very libertarian, I will dare to say even anarchist instincts. And the other one was Austin Peterson, which strikes me as very strange. On the one hand, he was trying to appeal to the more conservative wing of the libertarian movement, and on the other hand, he sometimes tweets or publish some things that sounded very left-wing. For example, he, on the 4th of July, if I am not remember wrong, he put a quote of the book of Tadeusz Russell, in which says that prostitution and gambling is what make America great. And it's not necessarily an argument that a lot of conservative leaning libertarians will agree, I think. But I don't know. It was an interesting race, I think.
Yep.
It was.
I actually I moderated a debate here in New York City that had John McAfee and Austin Peterson and Gary Johnson in it, and I think their strategies were different. McAfee just wanted to be himself and was hoping that his eccentricity and weird stories from his past, like his time fighting the authorities in Belize, would attract people. But I think he was still a little too weird even for the libertarians, although a very likable character. Austin, who I used to work with, I think actually did the most strategic thinking. So he's not like a hardcore conservative. He's very much a libertarian in the Ron Paul mold, but he recognized correctly, I think, that this year the most disaffected people from either of the two major parties would be coming from the Republican Party. The Democrats may not love Hillary, but they'll vote for her. A lot of the Republicans dislike Trump and were willing to drift away somewhere else if someone seemed like a plausible alternative. It might have been a good year even for the Libertarians to have nominated a moderately conservative figure like a Mitch Daniels or Bill Weld, dare I say it, at the top of the ticket. And I'm not saying those people would be philosophically pure, but I mean, if you were just strategically thinking about how to get votes, that would probably be a good way to do it. So Austin is a libertarian, and he was trying to think strategically the way that a Bill Weld would if he were at the top of the ticket for the Libertarian Party. But he's younger, less experienced, hasn't governed a state, so Gary Johnson won, and the strange thing about Gary Johnson is that I think he appeals slightly more to disaffected Hillary voters than to disaffected Republicans. And I think it was still wise to have Johnson lean a little left and Weld lean a little right and try to get people from both sides. And they may yet succeed in bringing new people in from both the Democratic and the Republican Party. But strategically, it would have been a good year for the Libertarian Party to look like what the Republican Party should be if it were truly free market, so that all of the upset Republicans would say, what are we going to do now? We can't vote for Trump. Hey, look over there. That's what our party is supposed to sound like. It would have been a fantastic opportunity to just rip off a huge chunk of the Republican Party and turn them into libertarians, or at least try. Although I know, even as I say this, there are libertarians watching thinking, oh my God, that idiot Seavey wants to flood the Libertarian Party with Republicans. It'd be completely destroyed. And then the truly radical ones are saying, good, destroy the Libertarian Party. It's a joke anyway. But anyway, I think Austin wasn't quite famous or experienced enough to fully pull off that strategy, but I think he was thinking the right way tactically. Anyway. So he's not very religious, and he's comfortable with people from the left and the right, but he knew he needed to sound conservative to try to pull off that strategy, I think.
Interesting. I think there were other two candidates. One was a doctor, I think, from Florida.
Oh, one of them has since passed away. I would hate to. I would hate to identify the wrong person, but okay, that's him.
Yes.
Right. So I only got to see him once. He was at the event where I moderated the debate, although he wasn't in the same debate. And the crowd seemed to like him. He was amusing. He did sort of funny, energetic rants, and now he's gone.
He was kind of interesting. I mean, he was a broad-speaking libertarian. I mean,
it's nice that he had an impact while he was still here.
Yes, and the other guy was an anarchist. It was very funny. I think it's the Libertarian Party is the only party that has an anarchist running for president, which is kind of strange.
And he's from the state of New Hampshire, which is arguably the most libertarian state in the U.S. Although New Hampshire is also a good example of how people can be politically libertarian-leaning, but culturally very right or very left. So when about 10 years ago, a lot of radical libertarians started moving to New Hampshire, they thought they would fit right in, and the locals would accept them, and they would become a big influence on local politics. And actually, part of my family's from New Hampshire, and I guess we're somewhat libertarian, or I mean I am, but so are a couple other people in the family. But it turns out that New Hampshire is also very moderate and quiet and culturally conservative, not in the way the U.S. South is, with lots of Bible thumping, but just sort of quiet and staid in a somewhat puritanical way. And I think the locals thought the influx of young radical libertarians that those people were crazy and annoying at times. So there's actually more tension between the new libertarians and the old population of New Hampshire than they expected. And I'm not sure how much effect they'll have on the state's politics. But every once in a while, you'll hear strange stories out of New Hampshire about really radical libertarians. And so that the young candidate from New Hampshire was one of those, basically.
Yes, but I think, I mean, I was very interested in Hess after reading The Death of Politics. I read his biography, and he talks about West Virginia a lot, and he moved to West Virginia, and he used to make the argument that West Virginia was the most libertarian place on the earth, and it was kind of strange because West Virginia was a very strange case of a rural state with a large majority that voted Democrat. It was very curious. I suppose that it has to do with Kennedy winning the state, and it was emblematic for the Kennedy style of liberalism. And their senator was a former Ku Klux Klan member, which was registered as Democrat, which was kind of strange. I suppose this is the least controversial thing that I could say about him. I guess that the politics of West Virginia are still a mystery to me. I don't think the Libertarian Party there, I think, is in bad shape, and even when Hess was there, and apparently he was relatively popular there, it was in bad shape. He didn't. I think he was supposed to be a gubernatorial candidate, and he didn't manage to get enough signatures.
I haven't checked this, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that Trump is popular in West Virginia, because it seems like whether West Virginians vote Republican or Democrat, they always sort of lean pessimistic. There's a lot of poverty there, and
Yes.
and I don't think they really believe that global trade will improve their prospects. I think they just want to be protected, and there's a certain acceptance of poverty there. Even when people, Ron Bailey from Reason Magazine, who's very much a lover of science and progress, has a lot of relatives in West Virginia. And he said that even when they start to make money there, they still tend to have sort of ramshackle houses with sloping, half-broken porches and stuff. And there's just sort of a cultural acceptance that things aren't going to change much, and maybe you shouldn't really try that hard. And now I suppose I'm insulting West Virginia, but that seems to be part of the culture.
I hope you know. I don't know. It's kind of cool. I mean, it's quite a curious place.
Oh, I should say, by the way, the young New Hampshire radical libertarian we were talking about earlier is Darryl Perry.
Yes.
I don't think we named him, but
yes.
He was good.
I think going to other topic. Well, back to your book. How do you convince Amy Schumer to be in her show? I don't know.
Amy Schumer. That one I owe to my agent, who was just sort of watching for. Even on shows that aren't using actors, a lot of TV shows sort of use casting calls. They'll send out little notices to agents and other producers and say, we're looking for people to talk on this topic, or we're looking for somebody of this sort. Amy Schumer mostly does sketch comedy, but on her show, which just stopped production, by the way, on her show, she would do one interview per episode, and she liked to just talk to people who did something that she didn't know about, or believed something that she didn't understand. And sometimes it would just be talking to a hairdresser or maybe an inventor. In my case, they specifically put out a call for a global warming skeptic. And I mean, I'm not as radical a skeptic about it as some people are. I mean, I don't think it's all nonsense or a complete conspiracy. I think we should keep studying the matter. But I do think there's been a lot of panic and hype, and Al Gore is often overselling the issue. And of course, they tend to leap immediately to very pro-government solutions instead of trying to think of free market solutions. So that was the topic they actually wanted me to go on and talk about. And of course, you never say no if somebody invites you to be on TV. Whether they want you to talk about gay marriage or, you know, asteroid defense, or whether you like cats, you say yes, and then you go on and hopefully you get a chance to talk about other topics you're also interested in. And she was actually quite nice. I went on expecting it to be sort of like The Daily Show, which is, you know, good in its own way. I shouldn't pick on The Daily Show. I know one staff member of The Daily Show did buy a copy of my book, although they haven't invited me to be on yet. But The Daily Show sometimes attacks people, not so much when they do the on-set interviews, but the edited segments, they'll really kind of misrepresent people. I think Peter Schiff was on, and they made it look like he was insulting retarded people or developmentally disabled people, and he really wasn't. But they don't care because they figured they could edit it and get a laugh out of it. So it's dangerous to let them edit you. If you get a chance to talk to them one-on-one, maybe it's a little better. But I went in prepared for the worst. When I talked to Amy Schumer, I thought, like, okay, everybody here is going to be left-wing. They're going to try to get me to say something stupid. If it's about global warming, they're going to trick me into trying to, like, admit that this part of Manhattan where we're talking is going to be underwater in 50 years, and then ask me how long I can hold my breath or some, you know, crazy stunt like that. But actually, she's quite happy to make jokes about herself and admit that she doesn't really know a whole lot about these topics. So she's very self-deprecating and humble and easy to talk to. And when they do the interviews, or when they did the interviews on her show, now that it's over, you really do sit at a real bar with her for like a half hour, and you have alcohol. So it's almost like you're on a date with Amy Schumer. It's pretty cool. And she's quite charming, I think.
Interesting.
I don't always agree with her, but she was nice anyway.
Interesting.
So it was fun.
I mean, back to the late night issue. I mean, well, probably the name of this show is in part to do with late nights, because I mean, here in Peru, people used to get late nights by, I don't know, handing copies of VHS, because HBO used to carry some of it used to carry Conan, but now it doesn't. The only late night that now it's carried is Jimmy Kimmel on DirecTV, and no, Jimmy Kimmel, no, the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Jimmy Kimmel isn't carried by any.
I lost track a long time ago.
So it's quite of difficult getting late nights, but with the internet it became much more easier. People upload the parts of interviews or complete interviews, and I didn't find it very interesting, but I started watching because of sometimes rock bands played, and I was interested in that. But there was a very interesting episode of the Tonight Show with Jay Leno, in a very interesting interview with Ron Paul. And in the end of the interview, actually, he says that they are going to play the Sex Pistols, and he said to Ron Paul, they are going to play something that you know something about, Anarchy in the UK, and then the Sex Pistols start to play. It was a very strange combination, but I think in their own way, both Ron Paul and the Sex Pistols are radically against the state. I mean, sometimes it's funny to think about rock bands, because a lot of people think that rock bands are just left-wing, and they are going to be happy with left-wing governments. But actually in Cuba, the punks have been basically at war with the Communist Party there. The same thing happened in Vietnam, and in other places. So it was very funny. And well, if I am not wrong, the Sex Pistols song Anarchy in the UK come out when there was the Labour government was in power.
Yep.
And actually the Dead Kennedys were were started when Jerry Brown was governor, so it
right.
wasn't like.
And I think in some cases the bands, the bands were probably left wing, and then they were very disappointed that the politicians who
Yes.
ostensibly represented them didn't really do what they were supposed to. But it's a start. Cynicism and skepticism about government is half the battle. And even some bands who we don't think of as libertarian or conservative will do things that are implicitly or functionally libertarian, like the Rolling Stones basically moved from England to the United States to get away from taxes, as have many other British rock musicians. So can't blame them for that, even if they don't necessarily talk about our philosophical principles. And gotta love the Beatles for doing songs like Taxman. That's pretty good. The song Revolution is actually quite skeptical about left-wing over-optimism. So that's good. The Who have some fairly libertarian-sounding songs, including lines like "Watch the police and the taxman miss me, I'm mobile." Gotta love that. So we'll take our little victories where we can, and I'll also say that even when rock bands are ostensibly being left-leaning, I suppose a lot of times only intellectuals who really care about politics notice how political the bands are trying to be. It's often pretty subtle or ambiguous. The same is true of Hollywood movies. I mean, probably if you talk to most Hollywood producers, they'd say they were Democrats. They may even be donating to Obama or Hillary, but they don't want to lose half the audience if they don't have to. So to give an example, in a lot of action movies, the villain might sometimes be a crazy environmentalist who wants to exterminate humanity, but they'll usually throw in a line where they reveal that the environmentalist doesn't really care about animals. He's actually got a corporation that he's trying to boost the profits of or something like that. So they can kind of have it both ways. Like if you hate environmentalists, you'll like the movie, but if you hate corporations, you'll also like the movie. So Hollywood likes to have it both ways, and so do most rock stars. Even a band that is clearly left-wing, like Rage Against the Machine, to one of their more popular sort of militant black left-wing sounding songs like Bulls on Parade, the actual lyrics say almost nothing about politics. I mean, almost all, like I think the opening line is the microphone explodes, and it's all the usual sort of, hip hop, I'm the greatest rock star that ever was, I will rock the microphone, and so forth, bravado. And this has very little to do with politics. So things could be worse. I mean, if all of those musicians suddenly decided they wanted to teach the world Marxism, we'd be in pretty big trouble. But for the most part, they would rather,
yes.
would rather just make money.
Yes, no, but I was thinking the sad part of Jay Leno leaving the Tonight Show was, I mean, he was not a libertarian necessarily, but he was one of the few people in the media that didn't try to mock Ron Paul. I think he is someone which is relatively socially liberal, but on other issues more fiscally conservative. And
Jon Stewart was nice to the Pauls on The Daily Show too, I should say.
Oh, I didn't watch his interview, but I think he was kind of interesting. And he has also Joe Rogan, which was also a libertarian, I guess.
Sort of. I think Rogan's favorite topics are not exactly political. He's sort of interested. He's interested in things like psychedelic drugs and UFOs and other radical topics like that. But he's sort of open-minded enough and skeptical about authority enough that it makes him sound pretty libertarian.
I mean, the problem of the current late night shows is that more or less all are liberal in some sense or another. And the only one that I think is not as liberal as the other is Jimmy Kimmel, but not because I think he's more conservative, but because I think he's very apolitical in the large degree. Someone like Craig Ferguson, it was very curious. Somewhat like Greg Ferguson was more of an independent-minded kind of person, and it was very curious because he was in a punk band, and I was supposed that he was more left-wing. But as I think you tried to make that argument in some place about how punk and capitalism could coexist in some way, I think he was when he grew old, he was kind of of an old punk is sometimes an angry punk, and in some ways is not necessarily all the time with the left. And was kind of interesting his show. He interviewed Cornel West. He used to have an Egyptologist. A lot of times there was an Egyptologist, Cara Cooney, I think it was her name. It was like 5 or 6 times in the show. It's quite strange for a late night show have someone like an Egyptologist. So I guess it was kind of strange. I was hoping that there was someone libertarian that who could host a late night show, but it seems that it's still for the moment it's more complex.
Well, yeah, I'm willing to audition if anybody's looking for someone. Well, actually, I suppose over on Fox Business Network, at least, there's libertarians John Stossel and Kennedy, if people wanna watch them. And she's a veteran of MTV.
Yes.
And rock and roll savvy. The essay of mine that you were referring to, I guess, is Conservatism for Punks, which I wrote back in 2010. It was around the time of the Tea Party and Rand Paul first becoming prominent. And so I was hoping that the libertarians and the conservatives might fuse neatly and, well, basically all turn into libertarians. But I wrote an essay about it that was in a book called Proud to Be Right. And that was sort of the last gasp of me really identifying as a type of conservative. I tend not to do that as much anymore. But I was reflecting back to some degree on my childhood in the 80s when it seemed to me that Ronald Reagan and new wave music both represented flowerings of capitalism and, you know, the Western civilization's capacity for creativity and freedom. And just as Johnny Rotten, I suppose, represents both anti-authoritarianism and some left anarchist impulses. So these things can blend, and I'm all for it. And the 1980s was a nice time for that in some ways. Although I realized, you know, again, apologies to Nicaragua. But
yeah, well, now to the part of the interview when I asked you about the history of the Guy Fawkes mask.
Oh, right. So, well, there's certainly an example of blending things from right and left. That, according to Wikipedia, at least, I'm one of the first people who ever wore the Guy Fawkes or V for Vendetta mask, as some people know it, in a real-world political protest. And I have to admit, in my case, it's for sort of bourgeois corporate reasons, because left anarchists were having a protest against the movie V for Vendetta back in, I guess it was 2006. And one of them was wearing a Guy Fawkes mask. So my group of anarcho-capitalists were showing up to basically to defend Warner Brothers and Comics against the left anarchist protest. And while we were out there, someone from Warner Brothers Publicity offered to get us a bunch of Guy Fawkes masks that they had made up to celebrate the release of the movie. So we said yes. So the left anarchists would be horrified to hear this, but my group's Guy Fawkes masks actually came from the company that made the V for Vendetta comic books and movie. That's how hopelessly embedded in the establishment I am. But we were anarcho-capitalists, and we, you know, argued with the left anarchists a little. And then an article about it got written up, and they talked about the left anarchists led by, I believe his name is, I'm blanking on their leader's name. It was something like Adam Friedman, but I might have that wrong. And I know he's I might be getting the last name wrong because he's a freegan, which sounds similar to Friedman.
Yes.
And a freegan being someone who tries to eat
Yes,
garbage whenever
yes.
possible because he doesn't want to waste the rest of the produce of the agricultural system. So his mask was on before mine, I admit, but then I managed to get out a few more for my group, and I wrote an article about V for Vendetta for Wall Street Journal as well, which was an interesting experience, and it was edited by a friend of mine who's more of a neoconservative, and she, I think, was having a very hard time understanding that I actually did sympathize with the anarchists. She kept wanting me to put more, I mean, because the average Wall Street Journal reader does not sympathize with anarchism. They think of anarchism as being on the left and an enemy.
Yes.
So she kept saying, like, I don't understand these lines here. You make it sound like you like the movie and you like the anarchists, and you're writing for the Wall Street Journal. You have to make fun of the anarchists. And she kept like trying to tweak the lines, and I try to tweak them back. And I mean, I'm glad the piece appeared, and hopefully it gave a few conservatives some anarchist ideas. Actually, one point I wanted to make in that Wall Street Journal piece that I still think is a really novel and interesting one if you want to fuse different political traditions, and I mentioned it in my book Libertarianism for Beginners as well, is that arguably the original conservative writer in modern times, Edmund Burke from the late 18th century, was also the first anarchist writer of modern times. Because even though in his most famous writings, he talked about tradition and authority being good things, when he was a younger man, he wrote a book called A Vindication of Natural Society, in which he argued that if you really wanted to get rid of violence, you should get rid of war, and thus you should get rid of the state. And a lot of people think he was just being satirical, and maybe that's true, but I mean, sometimes you hear kids on the internet these days, at least in the United States, talk about a long troll when people keep a joke going for such a long time that you can't tell whether the person is serious or joking. That's a pretty long troll. If Edmund Burke was just joking, he wrote an entire book arguing for abolishing the state. And you know, I suspect as a young man, he thought, maybe this is true, maybe these ideas are true, it's worth thinking about. So he wrote the whole book, and then decades later, when he was in Parliament and writing conservative things, he basically said, "Oh, that was, you know, I wrote that when I was young. I didn't really mean that." But I suspect he kind of believed it. You know, I mean, I think there must have been an element of truth to it. So anarchism and conservatism have some roots in common. If they rediscovered that, maybe they could all turn into libertarians.
But back to speak about movies, what do you think about this year in films? I think it has been an interesting year. I was surprised by Deadpool, for example. I was just, I don't know, something that I do is go to movies in the weekend, so I went, but I was really enjoyed Deadpool. I mean, X-Men. I like Suicide Squad, Independence Day. Well, the Batman versus
Superman,
Captain America.
Him too.
And the last that I see was Star Trek. So yeah, I think that have something, but Deadpool was the one that really surprised me as better than I used to think.
Yep. And it's interesting that Deadpool was the cheapest, most inexpensive X-Men movie to produce of the 10 that they've done so far. It only cost them something like $50 million, and it made the most money, about $700 million, which is, I think, about twice as much as the next X-Men movie. And by contrast, they spent something like $200 million on X-Men Apocalypse, and only made about $400 or $500 million. So there have to have been meetings now at Fawkes, where they've said we've got to make more movies like Deadpool and fewer movies like the big ensemble X-Men movies. So it'll be interesting to see what impact that has on the franchise. I suspect they're going to try to do more solo character movies and fewer with the big team, which is a little sad for me because I like the whole team. When I was a kid, I read X-Men comics. I didn't particularly read Deadpool comics, but it was funny. I don't know if they can keep doing that. Maybe it's the sort of thing you can only really effectively do once and surprise people. I don't know how many.
I mean, Ryan Reynolds is a good actor, and Morena Baccarin, I think she was in Stargate, if I am not wrong.
Oh, she may have been. I'm not sure. I know she was on Firefly and V, and a few episodes of Homeland. I'm not sure what else she's done.
Well, I think I have seen in Stargate. Well, but anyway, I mean, it is quite interesting. On the other hand, there are other pictures that are not necessarily science fiction, but I don't know if you have seen Maggie's Plan, for example.
Nope.
The funny part is that they mentioned the stuff about the Guy Fawkes mask. There was a discussion in, I think, in supposedly the New School for Social Research. One of the characters is an anthropologist, and her wife is an anthropologist, which is played by Julianne Moore and Julianne Moore. Yes, Julianne Moore, and she's talking about what's the meaning in anthropology of the Guy Fawkes moss in the question of the identity. It's quite an interesting film.
Yeah, you remind me that since I grew up thinking of the right and the left in the U.S. as fairly predictable categories, with the two parties having been very, very similar for at least a couple of decades. I was kind of amazed when I saw a Ron Paul poster that someone made that showed the Guy Fawkes mask and the anarchy symbol and the American eagle, and said, revolution and Second Amendment all at the same time. And even for me, it was almost confusing. Like, oh my God, it's all over the place at the same time, even though, it all fits together. But I would imagine for the average American, they just feel like, whoa, this is a montage of totally discordant things. But it shouldn't be. They should see the connection there, the common element of individual freedom and suspicion of government.
Yes, I mean, to add to the point, my favorite movie is Slacker from Linklater, which has directed Boyhood, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight. And he has his first movie is a very small movie. I think he made it with $21,000. It is a very small movie. And he
Was it Slacker?
Slacker, and yes, and I have seen that movie many times. I think 5 times, and there was a part in the movie when he talked about anarchism, or a guy which in real life is a professor of philosophy talk about anarchism, and I didn't realize that there was a part when they are talking about anarchism and that there was like a truck with a rumble sign, because the movie was shot in part in '88. So there was a rumble sign, and it's very funny because, I mean, Richard Linklater is more or less, how to put it, a left-winger, I guess, I suppose. But I mean, he's an heterodox left-winger, but he was making an anarchist critic of libertarianism. But even with that, the fact that there was the poster of Ron Paul mean that he knew something about him. I don't think it was something that he didn't have think about it.
And he's actually used Alex Jones, the libertarian turned populist conspiracy theorist, in 2 or 3 of his movies, just as sort of a random wacko shouting on the streets of Austin, which is how Alex Jones got his start in Austin, Texas. And of course, Ron Paul's also from Texas. So I think in Austin, Texas in particular, almost everyone is left-wing, but they've got a big anti-authoritarian kind of anarchist streak, a little bit like some of the San Francisco hippies back in the 60s and 70s who were not fond of the democratic establishment or LBJ or the war, and had a little bit of paranoia, which may have been caused by the marijuana, but you know, they tended to think like, you know, the man's out to get us, we might have to hide in the woods, what are those helicopters doing overhead, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there have been, I think, recent interesting films about, I mean, the American independent film scene is very interesting. I like Whit Stillman. The problem with Whit Stillman films are that they usually only come here on DVD, or HBO puts some time.
They're not too popular here either, actually. He's lucky. I think his last one he made about $7 million, which is not much by Hollywood standards. So he's a rarefied taste. But
I think he's quite curious, because it's supposedly he's somewhat conservative. I mean, he's supposedly as paleoconservative in some sense, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing is that his father, if I'm not wrong, worked as an economic advisor to Kennedy, which is kind of strange.
I think he's very establishment. I mean, and not necessarily in a bad way, but he's a little bit. He's sort of aristocratic, at least by United States standards, and we don't officially have an aristocracy. But you know, there are rich families that tend to go to Ivy League schools and know about things like ballroom dancing and you know, and yacht clubs and things like that. So I think he's sort of from that set, and he kind of likes it. So he's got and he respects religion, which is rare amongst some Hollywood people. So that makes him somewhat conservative. And his movie Barcelona, I thought, was subtly quite conservative. Anyone from the United States who's had to go overseas and argue about the U.S. military would recognize that movie was very unusual in its depiction of. I mean, just to depict United States citizens arguing with continental Europeans and winning is pretty rare in a Hollywood movie.
And he knows about labor history, because he in that movie talks about the difference between the ALF, the American Labor Federation, and the Congress of Industrial Unionists, and that's true. I mean, it's quite interesting, Barcelona.
I remember a friend of mine didn't believe me when I said that Whit Stillman was conservative years ago, because my friend said, "Oh, come on, he's like a Hollywood director. That's impossible. He couldn't be a conservative." To which the first thing I said was, "Well, like in Barcelona, there's actually a scene where a character is swing dancing with the Bible as his partner. I think, you know, by Hollywood standards, that's pretty conservative."
Yes, that's. I mean, one of the directors that actually made me write a piece in the Metrodus was Annalili Amirpour. I think, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well. It's this Iranian American director that made A Girl Walks Alone at Night. I think it was a very good movie.
You know what? It's funny you mentioned that. I tried so hard to see that movie. And you'd think here in New York City, there are so many movie theaters, I would have succeeded. But it was only showing at a few places, and every time I went, like the tickets sold out just before I got there. I think one night they sold out, and it was like below freezing, and I had to walk all the way back home without a ticket. And they were showing it at a theater here that only had about 20 seats, so it sold out much quicker than I was expecting. And I think all of the Iranians in New York City saw the movie. So it would be sold out every night, and you'd see young Iranians going to see it. So I actually did not see it, but I wanted to. One of these days, I should.
It's a good film. It's a curious history also. I mean, here it's very difficult that an indie film opens in cinema. I mean, Magic's Plan, it actually surprised me. Here, there are more or less mainstream cinema, but has one room for independent films, and in that place they open it, this Magic Plan. But it's very difficult for independent films to open. The funny part was not even a Scott Pilgrim versus the War open here in Peru, which was kind of strange. But the funny thing is that here the black market is it was a big hit in the black market. So a lot of people you see on the streets with a pirated Scott Pilgrim versus the War DVD. It was very funny.
I think a movie coming out next month, here at least, that might be of some political interest is The Accountant with Ben Affleck. And the premise is that he's sort of a mildly autistic person who's really good at math. So he's become an accountant for dictators around the world. And now some of them are trying to kill him or something like that. So he has to fight back against his former clients. And it looks like it's probably fairly intelligent and well-directed, and more political than the average Hollywood movie probably. So I'm looking forward to The Accountant next month. And the month after that, Doctor Strange, because I'm still going to superhero movies until they completely burn us all out on that topic, and we all get sick to death of superheroes. But for now, I'm still loyally going to see the Marvel ones. I'm having doubts about the DC Comics ones, frankly, but I still like the Marvel ones.
Well, here, I mean, Captain Fantastic was open in, I think, if I'm not wrong, in Sundance, but it's going to open here in Peru, which was kind of surprised me, but not necessarily, because Wes Anderson, for example, has opened here. Some of his movies has opened, and initially his movies used to open in the art house cinema, but now in more generally. And actually, the last film of Wes Anderson that I saw, which was the last one, the Grand Hotel Budapest. Actually, the room was complete. I have been sometimes in science fiction films, and you will think because of the publicity that this kind of stuff have, and I have been in quite empty rooms, so it was very funny.
Grand Budapest Hotel made me think that Wes Anderson should try doing a full-fledged science fiction movie, or perhaps even, perhaps specifically, a steampunk movie. Grand Budapest Hotel felt almost like steampunk. It had the kind of like
yes.
affected 19th century kind of feeling. You know, he could have some people with blunderbusses and a few robots, and I think he'd be ready to go. He could do steampunk. He might be just the guy.
Yes, well, for ending, I think the last topic could be why isn't a lot of libertarian science fiction get adapted by Hollywood? Is because Hollywood is more liberal? Is because of
let's see. Well, you know, I think anytime Hollywood makes a movie, they want a simple, easily explained premise. So I doubt they're really averse to adapting libertarian stories. It'll just have to be a story where the main premise happens to be something that would appeal across political boundaries. Supposedly, they may be doing an adaptation of The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is a very libertarian science fiction novel by Robert Heinlein. But I'm sure that it's not the libertarianism that made them interested in it, nor has it driven Hollywood away. They were probably just interested in the idea of the moon rebelling against the Earth, I'm guessing. And then the fact that the inhabitants of the moon turn out to be anarchists, you know, is extra. But they probably would have liked the premise even if the lunar inhabitants were communists. So I guess it's sort of accidental. If there's a good sci-fi premise out there and it happens to be by a libertarian, we luck out. But it probably won't be sold or shot down on the basis of the politics alone. And now I'm trying to think, like, what's libertarian that hasn't been turned into a sci-fi movie that would be a really good pitch. I guess some of Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle's novels are sort of libertarian. Powell Anderson, I guess. I think there was a low-budget adaptation of his novel, The High Crusade, which is about knights getting abducted back in the Middle Ages by a flying saucer, and then they have to go to another planet and fight aliens. Oh, maybe one of the more libertarian things supposedly in the works is, I think they're working on an adaptation of Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, or at least at times there's been talk of that. Most Hollywood projects never come to fruition, so
Yes,
you know,
that's
for
right.
years they'll be talking about possibly doing it. So I'm not promising anyone that this will happen. But if Snow Crash got adapted, as people may know, that depicts a full-blown anarcho-capitalist society where instead of countries, there are francholates, which are little town-sized sort of designer communities based on a given nation state's plan. So you can have a little Hong Kong over here and a little Italy over there, and everybody's free to come and go. And that would be very educational. I was actually kind of happy even when I heard that the video game BioShock might get adapted into a movie. Now, BioShock is basically a parody of libertarianism. It depicts a libertarian community underwater that's fallen apart and gone wrong because of some of the potential problems with anarcho-capitalism and with Ayn Rand's thinking. But, you know, it'd still be a teaching opportunity. Sometimes that's as good as it gets. So I was hoping BioShock would get made, and apparently it fell apart. However, on a related note, there's talk of adapting Atlas Shrugged again, which I didn't think would happen for another generation after the last terrible set of Atlas Shrugged movies they made. But despite those doing horribly at the box office, there's talk of making a TV miniseries out of Atlas Shrugged, which is probably a good format. And they must have convinced the holders of the rights to the book, which I believe is now the Ayn Rand Institute, to loosen up a little bit and let them change the story a bit, which at first sounds scary. But the change that I heard about them making sounds like a good idea, which is basically, instead of having industrialists who are rooted in old-fashioned industries that made sense back when Rand wrote the novel, like railroads and steel manufacturing, make it tech tycoons resembling the owners of Facebook or Twitter or Google. You know, they have the same characters, but have their businesses be different and more modern, and then give it a little bit of an Edward Snowden anonymous hacker sort of vibe, which I think is a great idea. And a lot of young people might sympathize much more with Hank Rearden if he resembles, you know, Mark Zuckerberg or Edward Snowden or Julian Assange than they would if they thought he was, you know, a villainous old John D. Rockefeller type. So I hope that happens. That could be good. And in the meantime, speaking of Snowden and Ayn Rand, I don't know how many people have noticed this, but in the trailers for Oliver Stone's movie Snowden, about Edward Snowden hacking the government or leaking stuff from the government, there's a line in the trailer where someone says, "One man can stop the motor of the world." And as far as I know, no one ever actually said that to Edward Snowden, but they do say it in Atlas Shrugged. So somebody who worked on the
Yes,
script of that movie at least knows a little bit of libertarianism.
yes. I think, if I am not wrong, that there is a recent interview that where actually Oliver Stone says some nice things about Ayn Rand. So it's not necessarily, probably even for strange that it sounds, Oliver Stone is a left-wing fan of Ayn Rand in
Yeah,
some kind of strange way.
he's another example, I guess, to sort of bring things back to where we started. He's an example where I'll have to remind myself not to just react like a conservative and say, I hate that guy because he praised Hugo Chavez, although that is terrible. But I have to remind myself he might still have his uses. And sometimes if people are skeptical and anti-authoritarian, and in some ways Oliver Stone is, that can be useful, even if he doesn't understand anything about economics.
Yes. Well, I was thinking in that comic which was called Anarchy, if I'm not wrong.
The comic book? Did you say?
Yes,
The DC Comics character who looks sort of like the Guy
yes,
Fawkes mask? Yeah.
yes. It will be interesting to adapt him, but if I'm not wrong, in what part there have been two. One comic he was more or less an anarcho-communist. In other, he was more or less an anarcho-individualist kind of.
Right. I don't think the editors at DC Comics have a very good handle on political philosophy. So I think whichever writer gets his hands on the character can kind of do whatever he wants.
I like I like Greg Morrison.
Yep.
I
Me
think
too.
I should read his stuff because I like him because of the interviews, and he seems kind of
Yep.
interesting. Someone which is inspired by Robert Anton Wilson, and I like Robert Anton Wilson. I have read his Encyclopedia of Conspiracy Theories, which was a very fun read.
I would say my three-part advice on Grant Morrison would be if you want a short, self-contained sample of how his brain works, get the trade paperback of his mini-series called The Filth, which is about a guy who might be saving the universe or might just be a schizophrenic trapped in his apartment, and you're not sure which. And it's actually quite poignant because this may be what mental illness looks like, or he might be saving the universe. I'm not sure. Or if you read that and you like it and you want a much bigger dose, his magnum opus in a way is his series The Invisibles.
Yes, I have heard.
Went on for several years, so I mean it's a big chunk of stuff if you want to read the whole thing, but you could read one trade paperback and get a feel for it. And he came up with a simple premise that allowed him to do anything he wants, basically, which is there are two rival conspiracies throughout history. One's authoritarian and one's anarchist, and the people who are its leaders are wizards and time travelers. So he could pretty much do anything he wanted. Reality can change, time can change. He can bring in characters like the Marquis de Sade, but then have a punk in the late 20th century. And it was all building up to the transformation of the universe in the year 2012, and it's either going to become free-spirited or authoritarian, or try to resolve the two. So The Invisibles was good. And then next year, he has a graphic novel coming out starring the superhero The Flash. So that's about the only thing in comics I'm looking forward to right now. Other than that, now I just wait for the Marvel movies and haven't been reading as much of the stuff as I used to.
Yeah, I think I have. I mean, I have watched some things about the Invisibles, and it sounds kind of interesting. And I know that for adapting that into a movie, it could be complex. But I was thinking, why the Illuminati trilogy isn't adapted? I think Robert Anton Wilson has some hardcore fans.
Yep. Let's see. Well, I would say they did try to make I guess they made a stage play out of it back in the 70s. And I've never read the play or seen it, but it is kind of hard to imagine how that would work. I mean, it doesn't. I loved the Illuminatus trilogy as well, but it doesn't exactly have a tidy beginning, middle, and end
Yes.
like a normal story. Actually, maybe the Illuminatus trilogy should be an ongoing TV series. Then you
Yes.
could just bounce around between different subplots however you wanted. Hey, that's a pitch. Somebody in Hollywood contact me. I'm willing to write that script if Robert Anton Wilson's estate will allow me.
Oh, yeah. I remember something. There is this IndieWire which publish about films and that kind of stuff, and they made a list of the blacklist, which is a list of the projects that haven't been pitched. And generally, sometimes these projects the next year and the next years get pitched. And one of the stories was very interesting because it was a story about police shootings. I mean, shooting when the Patriots members of the sovereign citizens start to kill police, and then some of the police killings happen, and it was very, very strange because I think the project was about to be done, but I think in this context it's more difficult to be done. It was a very polemic statement that he was trying to make, I think.
You know, it occurs to me now that another reason it'd probably be easy right now to pitch the Illuminatus trilogy to Hollywood is that my impression is Hollywood people love conspiracy theories about the Illuminati.
Yes.
I forgot that, you know, I think of the Illuminati as this idea that's centuries old and all over the world. But in Hollywood, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about how, you know, Hollywood celebrities are actually members of the Illuminati, and hip hop musicians like to pretend they're part of the Illuminati.
Yes.
If they just add that to the Robert Anton Wilson story, they could probably sell it to somebody in Hollywood, unless, of course, it's too close to the truth, and then they'll all get assassinated. But
Yes.
but assuming it's not,
Yes,
now might be the time to sell it. Like have Nicki Minaj do a, you know, a cameo as the leader of the Atlantis faction or something.
It will be
You know,
funny.
actually, the X-Men, one of the X-Men movies we were talking about earlier, X-Men Apocalypse, is partly rooted in conspiracy theories because Bryan Singer, who directed it and co-wrote it, is friends with the disaster movie maker Roland Emmerich. And Roland Emmerich, since the very beginning of his career, back when he was in college in like the early 80s, has always been fascinated by ancient astronaut stories and the idea that like the ancient Egyptians may have known things about how the environment works and how astronomy works that we don't understand. And I think some of that has rubbed off from Roland Emmerich on his friend, Bryan Singer. So there was a little dash of that in X-Men Apocalypse. I mean, it was faithful to the comics, but the way that he kind of implied Apocalypse might, you know, have ancient, possibly alien wisdom or machines that shouldn't have existed that long ago, I think had a dash of Roland Emmerich's influence, for good or ill.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, I know that you talk about Ancient Aliens. One of the guys of the Ancient Aliens actually is a libertarian, I guess.
Oh, you know, I'm not surprised. I mean, and it's funny, I'm no longer sure anymore whether I should be embarrassed or pleased, because I used to, I'm basically a skeptic, and for 30 years have thought that really people shouldn't even talk about ghosts or God or psychics unless they have solid scientific proof. However, you know, I've tried to be a little more agnostic about some of it in recent years and recognize that people see things in the sky, UFOs, and I don't necessarily know what they are. It might be military, might be meteorological, but you know, it's probably warrants further investigation. So I'm trying to keep more of an open mind. And one thing I've learned in looking into some of that stuff is that a lot of the UFO buffs are basically libertarians. And it probably shouldn't surprise us because, of course, they think the government is hiding the greatest secret in the history of the world. So they're all terrified that the men in black are going to come from the FBI and silence them. And actually, I owe Reason Magazine an article one of these days. I promised the previous editor, Matt Welch, that I would write an article about whether or not there's a UFO cover-up. And the short answer is, I don't know if there are any aliens, but there is a UFO cover-up in the sense, at least in the sense that government has looked into the question and then lied about it at times. But then that's what government does. They've probably researched everything and lied about it at one point or another. But that's interesting. And there's footage online. Maybe this is a topic for another day, but there's footage online of former Arizona Governor Fife Symington admitting that he believes he saw a gigantic alien craft flying over Arizona, and he basically lied to the public at the time. This was 19 years ago, and said that, oh, you know, it was just military flares, don't panic. And now, all these years later, he admits, I don't know what that was, but I think it was an alien spaceship, and it was frightening, and I was shaking when I went home, and I have no idea what it was. But he lied to avoid panic, so that's a government cover-up right there. And there are other strange stories like that, but I don't know if if he really saw aliens.
For ending this discussion, we could talk about the X-Files. It's funny. I think the revival of the X-Files was interesting. I don't know if you see the new 6 episodes were kind of interesting, I think.
Yeah, In particular, the first one, the producer, Chris Carter, admits that he was influenced by Alex Jones, the libertarian/populist conspiracy theorist. So the first episode, as I guess you saw, was largely about the realization that it wasn't the aliens who took over the Earth in around 2012. It was the globalists. It was the global conspiracy, governments, corporations. They even mentioned, genetically modified foods, which I think are perfectly safe. But they mentioned the things that Alex Jones worries about, basically. So X-Files, in a way, now is fighting the globalists instead of just the aliens, which was a neat surprise. And Chris Carter, the producer, he actually used the word libertarian in describing the shift in the show.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Carter in an interview said that he was more or less an average Democrat, and that but he also said a very interesting thing that I think a lot of people that doesn't spend much time thinking about it, but that Bill Clinton in a lot of ways was kind of a Republican. He was just, talk not much about abortion, for example. He was more or less what was called a neoliberal, and in a more orthodox way probably than Hillary is, and it was kind of strange. But for strange, and despite that, most of the people involved in the production of the X-Files were liberals, including, I guess, even the actors David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson. The show for moments had a slight libertarian, and in some episodes even conservative kind of worldview.
Yeah. If you watch videos online of some of the older sort of 1980s, 1990s lecturers on the topic of UFOs, some of them spend a lot of their time talking about how we can't trust the Air Force, and if we can't trust the military or Congress, then our constitutional republic is dissolving, and we're losing the freedoms on which the U.S. was founded. So there is a sort of revolutionary, almost libertarian spirit there, born of paranoia in a way, but it's similar to the libertarian streak amongst the conspiracy theorists that we've been seeing lately. And of course, if Trump wins the presidency in November, I mean, he's kind of a conspiracy theorist. He's at least dabbled in those things. So we could be headed toward our first real conspiracy theory presidency, which to some of the libertarians probably sounds like total victory, but I'm worried it'll just mean a different type of fascism.
Yes. Well, with that note, I think we could end up this interview. Just reminded the people that your book Libertarianism for Beginners is available, I think, in the United States in Barnes and Nobles, I suppose.
Yep, Barnes and Noble, and of course online. You can get it at barnesandnoble.com or amazon.com, or even the website of the publisher, which is called For Beginners. And since we were talking about comic books earlier, maybe I should mention that if anyone watching this is in New York City this weekend, as we record, at the New York Comic Book Convention, For Beginners Books will have a booth, and I hope they'll have some copies of my book, so you could even look for it there if you're buying Iron Man and Spider-Man comics and need a change of pace.
Seems interesting. Well, thanks
Thank you.
you very much for being a very interesting conversation.